Walk through a narrow alley, shrouded in grime and fog, the air thick with the smell of sewage and coal smoke, while under your feet a slick of mud and refuse makes each step more treacherous than the last. It's dawn in Victorian London, and you find yourself in the heart of one of the city's most notorious slums. Permit me to take you back into these overcrowded warrens of poverty. From the tenements where entire families huddled in single rooms to the desperate labor of children, we will explore how the poorest lived and survived in the shadow of the world's richest empire. The information you're about to hear comes from the authentic voices of Victorian observers, reformers, and slum dwellers themselves, to paint an authentic picture of this dark underside of 19th century London. But it's not merely a tale of squalor and misery. There's also glimmers of hope. It's a story of resilience, community, and the slow march of reforms sparked by these harsh conditions. But before we do proceed, the scene must be set. Where and when are we? Victorian London, 1837 to 1901, a city of explosive growth, swelling from about 2 million people in 1840 to over 6.5 million by 1900. This rapid urbanization, fueled by the Industrial Revolution and migration from rural areas, created extreme overcrowding. By the 1880s, investigators like Charles Booth estimated that roughly 1/3 of East End Londoners lived in extreme poverty. And we'll see what that meant for daily life. How exactly was extreme poverty felt? And so, with those timelines set, let's go back into the slums, the overpopulated districts with names like Whitechapel, Bermondsey, and Bethnal Green, and witness the conditions that contemporary writers variously called pestilential human rookeries and darkest London. I think by the end, we'll better understand not only the deplorable conditions that spurned the reforms, but also the humanity and agency of those who had to go through it. And with that, let's begin. If you like this sort of content, give it a like and subscribe. And thank you very much to those supporting on the Patreon and who checked out the merch store. To the outsider, the most striking feature of the Victorian slums was the extreme overcrowding, along with the dilapidated housing. Rows of tumble-down houses, many subdivided from once respectable Georgian homes into labyrinths of tiny flats and single-room dwellings, cramped people together in unsanitary conditions. As one 1883 account famously described, these were those pestilential human rookeries where tens of thousands lived amid horrors, which call to mind the slave ship. Now, if you've watched my video on slave ships, well, you'll know exactly how terrible that is. Perhaps he was exaggerating, but, you'll see. Sunlight, that was a commodity. It rarely reached the interior of these slum courts. They were hemmed in by tall, sooty buildings, and sometimes by the arches of railways overhead, as depicted in those Gustave Doré engravings, the ones that I've added for your viewing pleasure. I don't think they were quite impressed when Doré gave too much of an honest depiction of London in his art, but, well, he was only the messenger. Filthy, unventilated alleys reeked of human waste and stagnant air. There was little to no proper sanitation. No sewers, no clean water. Inhabitants often just dumped garbage and chamber pot contents directly outside the window. One journalist described stepping into a slum court in Southwark and finding nameless filth and garbage coating the ground, a thick paste of indescribable filth obscuring even the cobblestones. Such vivid first-hand descriptions, well, it makes it pretty plain that slum housing was not just unpleasant, but whether they knew it or not, it was actively dangerous to health and safety. Now, you might think that inside the tenements things would be a little bit better, but unfortunately not. Most dwellings lacked basic amenities like plumbing and running water. A single outdoor tap might be shared by dozens of families, and privies, the outside toilets, overflowed or went unemptied. The buildings themselves were often decrepit fire traps, rotten and reeking tenements, in the words of one witness, with crumbling brickwork and leaking roofs. It's no wonder things like the Great Fire of London happened. Now, just a little note on Victorian firefighting. They wouldn't show up with water most of the time. What they would do, they'd show up with these fire hooks, and they would effectively just isolate the fire by ripping down the surrounding buildings. That's all they could really do. If you're interested in that, watch my Great Fire of London video. As for the buildings themselves, well, not many of them stand anymore. Now, wooden staircases decayed to the point of collapse, too. An 1883 missionary report noted stair rails missing, likely burned as firewood by tenants. Now that's desperate poverty for sure. And gaping holes that could send an unwary person plunging between floors. Windows, if not broken or boarded up, were encrusted with so much dirt that little light or fresh air entered. The slum rooms were tiny, dark, sparsely furnished. Andrew Mearns, the author of The Bitter Cry of Outcast London in 1883, which I do recommend you reading, was shocked to find many rooms scarcely 8 feet square, so that's about 2.5 meters square, with walls, quote, black with the accretions of filth accumulated over years. In such a room, one might be lucky to find a broken chair or a pile of rags serving as a bed, but many had nothing but bare, grimy floorboards for people to sleep on. Overcrowding was the norm. Every inch of space was monetized by slumlords, making multiple families often sharing a single room. He wrote in 1883, "Every room in these rotten and reeking tenements houses a family, often two." The words of Mearns certainly sums it up quite well. Privacy was non-existent, as you could imagine. One missionary recounted finding 7 people living in one underground kitchen with a deceased child's body lying in the same room, just because the family had nowhere else to put it. In another instance, a sanitary inspector discovered a household of father, mother, and 3 children, and 4 pigs cohabiting in a cellar. One can imagine the ventilation issues. Elsewhere, a widow lived with her 6 children, 3 of them adults, all together in one small room. Infants and the gravely ill shared space with everyone else. One sick man with smallpox was found in a single room, along with his wife recovering from childbirth, and their half-naked, dirt-covered children running about. Of course, conditions like this bred disease at an alarming rate. That's a point we'll get back to later on. But the overcrowding also meant that everyday life, the chores like cooking, washing, and also sleeping, had to take place in the same cramped area, and that made basic hygiene nearly impossible. People cooked over small coal fires or braziers in rooms lacking proper ventilation, adding smoke to the foul air. Clothing and bedding, rarely, if ever, properly cleaned, would be hung or laid out in these damp and dirty quarters, contributing to infestations of lice, fleas, and other vermin. One contemporary noted that it was common to, quote, grope your way along the dark and filthy passages swarming with vermin, and that was just while you were on your way to the slums. Yet despite these conditions, slum rooms were not that cheap, at least not for the poor. Exploitative landlords charged high rents relative to workers' incomes, precisely because housing was so scarce. A destitute widow might even rent out a corner of her own squalid room to lodgers to afford the weekly payment. In one tragic example, a widow occupying the only bed in a room let out space on the floor to a married couple for 2 shillings and 6 pence a week. It was common practice for laborers or homeless individuals to pay a few pence for a spot to sleep in an already crowded room or a corner of a hallway. These informal arrangements blurred the line between what was a home and common lodging housing. The absence of regulated, affordable housing forced the poor to accept any shelter they could, no matter how cramped or degrading it was. Thus, living arrangements in the slums defined what we might consider normal family structure. Nuclear families, extended relatives, even unrelated lodgers, and, in some cases, animals all mingled together under one roof. Privacy was a luxury that only the better off could afford. In the slum environment, family life often unfolded in public view, every joy and sorrow witnessed, and I imagine overheard by neighbors separated by only thin walls or partition curtains. Despite this, families strove to create a semblance of a home. Many poor Londoners were migrants from the countryside, or Irish immigrants fleeing the famine, bringing with them strong ties of kinship. It was not uncommon for relatives to cluster in the same street or court. A widow might take in a niece's family, or adult children might remain with parents because they could not afford to marry and set up elsewhere, which sounds quite like what's going on in our modern time, to be honest. Well, the notion of childhood as a protected, separate stage of life, that's also more of a modern concept, and that barely existed for the slum poor. Children as young as 5 or 6 had to contribute to the family's survival, as we will see with the child labor later on. As a result, children in the slums matured quickly, often exposed to the harsh realities of adult life, hunger, work, and even crime from their earliest years. Daily life demanded cooperation among family members and neighbors alike. With limited resources, people had to share what they could. Communal bonds developed in these tight quarters. Women might mind each other's children, borrow a cup of tea or sugar if they even managed to get their hands on such things, or help nurse the sick next door. There was this kind of rough code of solidarity. Everyone knew that a fire, an eviction, or an illness could happen to any one of them at any time. One first-hand observer noted that even in the worst slum courts, some residents tried to maintain a bit of order and decency. For example, scrubbing their doorstep or patching a broken window with rags. Amid the filth and the chaos, small acts of domestic pride shone through. In the 1851 work, London Labour and the London Poor, journalist Henry Mayhew described visiting a garret where a poor seamstress, though destitute, had managed to keep one tablecloth immaculately clean, a surprised possession, a sign of self-respect in a world determined to strip her of it. Things like this put a human face on this situation, I think. Reminds us that the slum dwellers were not just passive victims. but they strove to create home and community under seemingly impossible conditions. However, the pressures of poverty could also strain and splinter families. Overcrowding and hardship led to frequent quarrels, and in some cases domestic violence fueled by alcohol or just sheer desperation. Many slum neighborhoods had a pub on every corner, and drunkenness was a common escape from misery. Victorian social investigators often castigated the poor for intemperance, noting that men sometimes drank away little money they had, while their children went hungry. And that's not just a slander. There's truth to those observations. At the same time, we have to recognize the context. Gin or cheap ale offered brief relief from cold and hunger, and for some, a pub was the only warm, lit place that was accessible at night. The toll of alcoholism on family life was real. Reformers reported cases of wife beating or child neglect in the slums where drinking was rampant. At the same time, many women in these communities became the de facto heads of households, stretching scant budgets and doing informal work, like washing or sewing, to keep their families afloat when the male breadwinner fell victim to drink, illness, or abandonment. Tragically, death was always around, too. Infant mortality in London's slums was astonishingly high. Roughly 1 in 4 children born in the slums would die before they reached their first birthday. 1 in 4. Not very good odds. Diseases like measles, diphtheria, diarrheal infections swept through the tenements, claiming young lives with horrifying regularity. Parents might lose multiple children in succession, a trauma documented in death registered and poignantly described in the letters of the poor. Overcrowding meant that the death of a family member often occurred literally in the arms of the living. The dead might share the same bed or floor until a coffin could be obtained, or a pauper's grave arranged. Mearns, in the work Bitter Cry, noted that one case of a poor widow in the slums who had her child's corpse lying in the one room for 13 days because she had no money for burial. The husband had taken his own life in despair. Now, just imagine that. It's pretty heartrending, isn't it? The immense emotional strain on these people. Well, even in death, neighbors would sometimes collect pennies to help pay for a funeral, or women would prepare the body of a deceased child or friend, performing these last rites of dignity when official society took a step back. But if there is one image that really captures the reality of the slums, it is that of the working child. If you haven't watched my video on terrible Victorian jobs, maybe you don't understand how bad it actually is, but we'll do the best we can to explain it in this brief section. Poverty forced virtually every able-bodied member of a slum family to contribute, and children, they were no exception. In an era before compulsory schooling, that was in 1870 they made the Education Act, by the way. It gradually made school attendance more common, but the enforcement took decades. Slum children as young as 5 or 6 took on work at home in the workshops or on the streets. Some labored alongside their parents. Little girls might help their mothers sew or prepare matchboxes at home for a pittance, and little boys might assist their fathers in trades like street vendoring, which they used to call costermongering, or dock work. Others struck out on their own as soon as they could walk and talk. They became crossing sweepers, shoe-shine boys, errand runners, and gutter scavengers. One of the most famous first-hand accounts of a slum child's life comes from Henry Mayhew's interview with an 8-year-old girl who sold watercress on the streets of London. This little watercress girl, as Mayhew dubbed her, had already been working for years. At the age of 8 years old, she was, in his words, entirely lost all childish ways, and was indeed in thoughts and manner a woman. Mayhew's 1851 narrative lets the child speak for herself, revealing the life of hardship and premature adulthood. She explained that she spent mornings at the crowded Farringdon market at 5 a.m., buying watercress by the bundle, and then walked the streets for hours crying out 4 bunches a penny watercresses to attract customers. Bareheaded, and wearing only a thin cotton gown and oversized old slippers even in winter, she endured the bitter cold. She said in Mayhew's interview, "I gets up in the dark by the light of the damp in the court. When the snow is on the ground, there's no creases. I bears the cold, you must." On a good day she might earn 1 shilling and 6 pence in sales, but out of this she had to pay back 6 pence for the cress stock, leaving perhaps 1 shilling profit. Often she made far less. "I oftener makes 3 or 4 pence," she said, "or 4 more hours of trudging work." Her earnings went straight to her mother, though, who is so very good to me, the girl insisted. She doesn't often beat me. Not often. That's a bit telling. But in exchange, the girl was given meager sustenance. When offered a hot meal by Mayhew during the interview, the girl refused more than a few bites, explained that if she ate too much, it made her sick because she wasn't used to meat, only on a Sunday. Indeed, she typically had no midday dinner at all. Quote, "Mother gives me 2 slices of bread and butter and a cup of tea for breakfast. Then I go till dinner time and has the same. We has meat of a Sunday, and of course, I should like to have it every day." This candid admission paints a stark picture of semi-starvation. 2 bits of bread with a bit of butter doesn't quite cut it, especially when you're covering that much ground trying to sell as much watercress as you can. And indeed, the diet of many slum children was largely bread, cheap margarine or dripping, and some tea if they could get it, with an occasional bit of meat once a week, and that's if they were lucky. Instead of play and school, childhood in the slums meant work and responsibility. The watercress girl, for instance, had already spent a year as a toddler minding an infant, a common job for little girls, essentially unpaid babysitting for relatives or neighbors, and had briefly attended a ragged school until the teacher's harsh beating scared her away from school entirely. Many children in the slums never attended school or dropped out very young. They simply could not afford the loss of income or the fees for basic schooling before the late 19th century reforms. By the 1860s and 70s, charitable ragged schools and then board schools did reach many kids in the slums, but the attendance could be pretty sporadic. Thus, illiteracy was widespread among slum-dwelling adults and children alike, and that only perpetuated the cycle of poverty. Children worked in some of the most dangerous and demeaning jobs of the Victorian age. In London slums, very young boys sometimes became chimney sweeps, sent up narrow chimneys to scrape soot, a practice that was actually made illegal in 1840 but continued illicitly for years. After all, the laws changed, but the chimneys did not. Other boys might get casual jobs as messenger boys or factory errand boys if they were slightly older, but the girls had fewer options. Some did street selling, like the watercress girl, or sold flowers and matches. Others assisted their mothers in sweated home industries, as they were called, like piecework, sewing artificial flowers, garments for pennies per dozen. But of course, I'm sure you've already guessed that many girls heartbreakingly drifted into becoming women of the night, especially as they reached their early teens. A contemporary social worker, Flora Tristan, noted that in certain London slums of 1840s, half-grown girls often openly solicited customers because they had no other way to earn money for their families. Victorian society was shocked by revelations of children doing this, such as W.T. Steed's 1885 expose, Maiden Tribute. But it was poverty and neglect that drove those girls to the streets in the first place. Everybody already knew about that. And so one consequence of child labor and poverty was the phenomenon of street children, orphans or runaways who essentially lived rough in the city. London slums produced countless of such children, often referred to as street Arabs in the slang of the day. They slept in outhouses, under bridges, or huddled together in alleys. Dr. Thomas Bernardo, a young Irish philanthropist, encountered these homeless children in the late 1860s in the East End. One famous anecdote tells of how an 11-year-old boy named Jim Jarvis guided Bernardo through the slum streets at night to show him where all the orphans slept, on rooftops and in barrels, which so moved Bernardo that he founded homes for destitute boys and girls. By 1870, Bernardo's homes were rescuing hundreds of children from the street. No, this was still a fraction of those in need, but you gotta start somewhere, don't you? The presence of ragged, hungry children, begging or working, was simply part of the everyday scenes. Novelist Charles Dickens had drawn public attention to such children decades earlier with characters like Oliver Twist and Joe the crossing sweeper in Bleak House. But these depictions were rooted in reality. People just didn't really take them too seriously because it was in a fiction book, I suppose. As one observer noted in 1883, the children of the slums grew up where all regard for decency and morality, let alone comfort, is out of necessity set aside. In other words, the environment forced them to become survivors above all. That was the important thing. Some of these youths fell into petty crime or gangs, which brings us to the next aspect of slum conditions, of course, crime and law enforcement. Now, I'm sure you can imagine that Victorian slums had a fearsome reputation as havens of crime. In fact, the very word slum was often used interchangeably with rookery, implying a nest of thieves. It is true that desperate poverty and overcrowding provided a fertile ground for criminal activity. When honest work did not pay enough to eat, some slum dwellers turned to theft, fraud, or vice. They had to scrape by somehow. Contemporary police reports and journals like London Labour and the London Poor offer insight into the criminal classes of the slums. These included pickpockets, burglars, con artists, and fencers. A fence is a receiver of stolen goods, and they often lived among the general poor. Certain streets or lodging houses were notorious as criminal hideouts. For example, the St. Giles Rookery in central London, earlier in the century, and parts of Whitechapel and Bluegate Fields in the East End, later on were well-known thief dens, where the police entered only warily. Rookeries typically had a warren of interconnected buildings and alleyways, perfect for criminals to hide from constables. In these enclaves, stolen goods could be quickly sold off or altered, and the residents often maintained a code of silence against informers. Petty crime was most common, hunger-driven theft like snatching food or picking pockets. Many slum criminals were opportunists rather than hardened felons. For instance, the street sellers or costermongers might smuggle goods without paying duties, or a poor woman might steal laundry off a line to sell for bread money. But that doesn't mean that the slums didn't harbor more organized forms of criminal gangs. Teenage and adult gangs with colorful names like the Wild Boys of Bethnal Green, or the youths later depicted as hooligans, sometimes roamed the poor areas, engaging in theft and brawls. The late Victorian period saw much public anxiety about the East End criminal gangs, especially after the sensational Jack the Ripper murders in 1888 in Whitechapel, which spotlighted the area's poverty and vice. While the Ripper's crimes were a bit singular, they unfolded in a milieu of dangerous streets where violence was routine. Now, in terms of people selling their services of vice, that was widespread in the slum districts too, considered both a crime and a social ill by Victorians. Poverty drove many women and girls, unfortunates as they were euphemistically termed, to sell sex to survive. Slum accommodations even facilitated this. Mearns noted a case of a slum mother who turned her children out into the street at night so she could rent the room for immoral purposes until long after midnight. Such lodging house services were important income sources for desperate families, albeit a terrible moral cost in Victorian eyes. The police estimated thousands of these women operated in the mid-19th century London, many of them working in the poorest neighborhoods, and of course, falling victim to abuse or disease. Incidents of assault and murder, often linked to drunken fights or robbery, peppered the newspapers. The dregs of society, from ex-convicts to loafer men who refused to work, found refuge in the anonymous slum crowds. One social investigator in the 1860s characterized the lowest class of London's poor as vicious, semi-criminal, and noted their neighborhoods in black on a map. Policing these areas was a huge challenge for the Metropolitan Police, founded in 1829. Early Victorian policing was still finding its footing, and slum residents were initially distrustful, or at worst times openly hostile to police interference. Gradually, slum policing did improve, with constables patrolling even in the worst rookeries. But it remained dangerous. In fact, Charles Booth's team in the 1890s had to be accompanied by police when they went to map poverty street by street. But despite all this, it's important to note that the majority of slum dwellers were not criminals. They were just honest poor people struggling to survive. Contemporary reformers often remarked on this. General William Booth of the Salvation Army wrote in 1883 that he personally knew, quote, thousands who had been down to the lowest depths, homeless, penniless, ragged, hopeless, and who were now respectable working people living decent lives. This suggests that with opportunity or aid, many slum residents eagerly escaped vice and crime. Furthermore, slum communities had their own form of order. Neighbors knew each other's business. A child stealing or a man beating his wife might be scolded or shamed by those around him. While outsiders saw only lawlessness, there were internal social checks. For example, informal penny banks or fellowship societies sometimes operated in pubs or churches, encouraging thrift and mutual aid even in these rough areas. In some, crime was present in the slums, and often born out of desperation, but it did not define every slum dweller. So, we're going to transition to the next section now of public health. Keep in mind that a lack of sanitation and healthcare probably killed more slum residents than crime ever did. Indeed, there were few places in Victorian Britain that were as unhealthy as the inner city slums. The convergence of overcrowding, poor sanitation, and malnutrition created ideal condition for disease. Slum streets were often described as fever nests or cholera dens. In the cholera epidemics that struck London, that is 1832, 48, 54, and 1866, the highest death tolls were in the impoverished districts, with contaminated water and open sewers. An observer of the 1849 cholera epidemic noted that in Bermondsey, the terribly poor Southwark slum, the living and dead shared the same space, with bodies sometimes left in rooms or piled in courtyards as cholera mowed down entire families. Part of the reason was the lack of a clean water supply. Drinking water came from pumps or standpipes, often polluted by nearby cesspits. The famous physician John Snow demonstrated in 1854 that a cholera outbreak centered on Broad Street, Soho, was caused by a contaminated pump, a microcosm of the slum sanitary crisis. Human waste piled up in courtyards and overflowed from basement cesspits into the gutters and waterways, making epidemics almost inevitable. But of course, people in the slums, they had pretty much no understanding of germ theory. That emerged slowly after the 1860s. But they knew, from bitter experience, that their neighborhoods were unhealthy. They used the word fever to describe a host of deadly infections. We're talking typhoid, smallpox, typhus, measles, all striking in wave after wave. Public health statistics gathered by early epidemiologists like William Farr showed shockingly high mortality rates in these districts. For instance, life expectancy at birth in some mid-century London slums has been estimated at under 30 years, dragged down by sky-high infant mortality and deaths of young adults from disease. Common diseases in the slums included tuberculosis, which they used to call consumption, which thrived in damp, unventilated rooms. Victims coughed their lungs up in one-room apartments shared with family who inevitably were exposed to the illness too. Smallpox periodically swept through, and before vaccination became common, it killed or disfigured many poor Londoners. One slum missionary's diary from the 1870s recounts going from hovel to hovel, finding smallpox patients or trying to get them to hospitals, often in vain. Scarlet fever and diphtheria preyed on undernourished children. Without access to proper medical care, a child's simple cough or rash could escalate to a fatal illness. Poor nutrition made things worse, of course. Diets low in vitamins meant diseases like rickets, bone deformities from vitamin D deficiency, and even scurvy from vitamin C deficiency occurred among slum kids. A government report in the 1850s remarked on East End children with bowed legs and stunted growth due to chronic malnutrition and even lack of sunlight. But of course we have to mention the great stink of 1858, when the Thames, which was essentially a giant open sewer, smelled so terrible that Parliament was compelled to fund a modern sewer system. The engineer Joseph Bazalgette's construction of the massive sewers in 1860 did gradually alleviate some sanitary issues for London at large. Sewage was carried away from the central districts. However, many slum precincts lacked local drainage to connect to the new system, so the benefits were uneven. Even by the 1880s, observers noted courts where the sun never penetrates, and never a breath of fresh air circulates, with refuge and ordure littering the ground. In such stagnant environments, infant diarrhea each summer was a major killer, what one reformer called cholera infantum. Perhaps the most visceral description of the slum filth come from The Bitter Cry of Outcast London in 1883. Its investigators wrote of having to climb over mountains of garbage and dodge rotting carcasses of dead cats or birds just to enter the tenements. The author exclaimed that compared to these tenements, the lair of a wild beast would be a comfortable and healthy spot. It doesn't seem like much of an exaggeration, I don't think. Ventilation and cleanliness were practically impossible under such congestion. People rarely could afford soap or fuel to heat water for baths. Public hygiene suffered. Many of the poor had only one set of clothes, which might never be properly washed. Not surprisingly, vermin infestation was rampant. Lice, rats, bedbugs. There's actually a line from an 1843 poem by Thomas Hood, The Song of the Shirt, that goes like this. Oh God, that bread should be so dear, and flesh and blood so cheap. The poor seamstress in the poem works herself sick for a bed of straw, a crust of bread, and rags. And indeed, many in the slums lived and died in rags amid the filth. Well, eventually, public health did improve slowly in later Victorian years thanks to vaccination, better medical knowledge, and some charitable clinics. By the 1880s, there were a few free dispensaries and hospitals, like the London Hospital in Whitechapel, where destitute patients could seek treatment, though these were overwhelmed and not easily accessed by all. The government began to take small steps, appointing medical officers of health for each borough who reported on the sanitary conditions. Laws were passed, like the Public Health Acts of 1872 and 75, compelling local authorities to provide clean water, sewage, and garbage removal. But enforcement lagged, especially in private slum properties. Still, by 1900, there was decent progress. Massive cholera outbreaks had been eliminated in London. The last was in 1866, and overall death rates in the city dropped significantly from mid-century peaks. Yet at the close of the Victorian era, the poorest districts had mortality rates double of those affluent areas, and some children remained the most at risk. It was clear that broader social change was needed to cleanse the slum. And this brings us to the economic hardships underpinning social life. Why people ended up in these conditions, and how they coped or failed to cope economically. Employment opportunities for the slum poor were typically irregular, harsh, and extremely low paying. Unlike the stable factory jobs of some industrial cities, London's economy was diverse but also highly casualized, meaning many workers were day laborers or part of informal trades with no real guarantee of income. The instability was a key factor in driving people into keeping them in slum conditions. These kinds of jobs slum residents held varied by gender, age, and district. A great many men in the East End, for example, worked on the docks or in riverside industries. These dock laborers epitomized precarious employment. Each morning, hordes of men gathered at the dock gates, hoping to be chosen for a day's work unloading ships. The work was back-breaking, and the hiring system brutal. Foremen would literally point to the strongest-looking men, while others were left empty-handed to try again tomorrow. Pay might be a few shillings for a full day's hard labor, perhaps 3 or 4, though it could be less if the work was task-based. In better times, a dock worker who got picked regularly could afford scant lodging and food for his family. But in worse times, he might go weeks with little work, falling behind on rent and pawning all the family's possessions. This casual labor system basically meant perpetual insecurity. Other men took jobs as construction laborers, costermongers, street cleaners, cab drivers, or worked in small workshops, etc. furniture making in Bethnal Green or boot making in Southwark. These sectors, too, were often seasonal or fluctuating. Many trades had more workers than work, so wages stayed low. Skilled artisans like printers, jewelers, and tailors could earn a decent living, but they generally did not live in the worst slums. It was the unskilled or semi-skilled laborers who filled the tenements. According to Charles Booth's survey, about 62% of London's poor were employed but in jobs with low or irregular wages. Even regular work paid pretty poorly. For instance, a costermonger or street vendor might gross 10 shillings in a week, but have to pay for his goods and cart, netting only a few shillings profit. A seamstress sewing shirts at home might earn as little as 1 shilling for 12+ hours of sewing each day, a case famously highlighted by Thomas Hood's poem, where the seamstress laments, "What are its wages? A bed of straw, a crust of bread and rags." Women's economic roles were crucial, but often even more underpaid. Many slum women worked as charwomen, cleaning other people's rooms and laundry, taking in washing, or even doing piecework like shirt making, matchbox folding, or brush making for a few pence per lot. These home-based industries were dubbed sweated labor because of the long hours and disgraceful pay. A report in the 1850s calculated that a woman making military shirts at home earned only about 6 pence for finishing a dozen shirts, which might take her all day. If she kept at it all week, she'd not even clear 3 or 4 shillings. Barely enough to survive. Even the whole family helped at such work, children threading needles or pasting matchboxes to increase output. Married women also had to maintain their own households, with no labor-saving appliances, cooking on coal stoves, hauling water, cleaning in cramped quarters, all while possibly trying to earn some income on the side. And so with income so low, debt and pawn shops were constant features of slum economies. Families frequently pawned clothing or tools on Monday to buy food, and then redeemed them on Friday when the wages came in, only to pawn them again next week. This knife and fork economy, as they called it, living hand to mouth, trapped people in a cycle where any extra expense, any illness, a new child, a rent hike could spell complete catastrophe. The Watercress Girl's testimony illustrated how even a child's pennies mattered for survival. In another first-hand account from the 1877 work Street Life in London, an elderly destitute woman, one of the so-called crawlers who begged while barely able to walk, expressed her frustration that she could not find work. She said, "I would much rather my hands were cut, blistered, and sore with toil than swollen, red, and smarting from exposure." This quote shows that the slum poor were often willing to work to exhaustion, cut and blistered hands, if only work was available. Unemployment or forced idleness was to them much worse, because it meant starvation and the shame of begging. When work failed or wages fell short, the last resort for many was the dreaded workhouse, or seeking charitable relief. And so, I suppose that's where we're at now. The dreaded workhouse. Well, the workhouse, a physical institution and a symbol of Victorian policy. Under the 1834 New Poor Law, relief for able-bodied poor in Britain was largely confined to these workhouses, deliberately harsh institutions intended to deter people from seeking help. In London, every parish or poor law union had its own workhouse, and by the 1850s, most had been rebuilt or organized to fit the new model, part almshouse, part prison. To enter the workhouse, or to go on the parish, as they called it, A destitute family had to submit a separation. Men and children and women were housed apart and perform work assigned by the masters, such as breaking stones or picking oakum, that is, teasing apart the old rope fibers for hours on end. I'm sure you've seen that. In case you're wondering what they were doing with those fibers, they used to put them in between the planks of the ships to sort of make them waterproof and then put a tar seal over it, kind of like an insulation. But yes, they needed it. So it's one of those finicky old jobs. Well, while cleaner than the slums, perhaps, conditions in the workhouses were notorious for their regimentation and meager rations. The gruel doled out became infamous thanks to that Oliver Twist asking for more. Well, indeed, Dickens' fictional depiction of the boy Oliver's hunger was based on the real regulations that forbade second helpings. One serving was deemed sufficient for paupers. But for slum dwellers, the workhouse was a last resort, seen as almost a living death. People would endure incredible hardship to avoid it. The common sentiment was that going to the workhouse meant surrendering one's own freedom and dignity. This aversion was well-founded, as a first-hand expose by journalist James Greenwood showed. In 1866, Greenwood entered a workhouse undercover as a homeless casual and wrote the work, A Night in a Workhouse. He described being stripped, forced to bathe in foul communal bathwater. That's right, with everybody else. And given only a wooden plank bed in a shed among scores of vagrants. Supper for those casuals was a bowl of skilly, kind of like watery oatmeal, which Grinwald actually missed because he arrived late, and the staff nonchalantly told him that, well, he was late for dinner, so he just wasn't going to get any. His account revealed the repugnant conditions and callous treatment in these institutions. Such reports, widely read, reinforced the public's understandings that the workhouse was a place of hardship, not help. Yet for all the fear and loathing, thousands did end up in workhouses, especially the most vulnerable, orphans, widows, the disabled and elderly. Inmates might include destitute older people with no family to support them. The workhouse was, effectively, an old-age home for the impoverished, or infants and children born there to single mothers. Most workhouses did have an infirmary for the sick, and by the 1880s, some evolved into primarily hospitals or refuges for the old, rather than work factories for the fit. The Poor Law did also allow limited outdoor relief, help given without entering the workhouse, such as small weekly stipends. But after 1834, this was strongly discouraged for able-bodied adults. Some London boards of guardians who ran the poor law unions eventually softened and gave outdoor relief in extreme cases, like a few loaves of bread or medicine to starving families. But the general rule was to refuse aid unless the person came into the workhouse. For a slum family, the decision to seek poor relief was an agonizing and humiliating one. It meant the breakup of the family unit, at least temporarily. Men and women were segregated in the workhouses, and children over the age of 7 were usually separated from parents, often sent to separate industrial schools. Pride also played a role. Many working-class poor had a deep-seated aversion to being labeled as paupers. They would say that they didn't want charity. All they wanted was a fair wage. This attitude was widespread, enough that even in the dire conditions, relatively few people actually went to the workhouses, unless they were absolutely destitute or physically unable to earn anything. For example, during the severe East End winter of 1867, Newspapers noted that large numbers of unemployed dock workers still tried to fend for themselves through pawn shops, begging, etc., rather than immediately swelling the workhouse rolls. Nonetheless, by the end of the 19th century, millions had passed through workhouse doors at some point in their lives. The slums continually fed people into the workhouse, and sometimes back out. Some individuals went in and out in a cycle, especially casuals, who would stay a night or two when they were utterly broke, and then leave to try fortune on the streets again. This was so common that workhouse casual wards became a part of the slum ecosystem, serving as a grim safety valve. But we should also note that the charitable shelters began to emerge later, such as Bernardo shelters for children or the Salvation Army shelters for men, to provide alternatives to the workhouse for some. Well, the economic hardship of the Victorian slum was certainly characterized by low wages, insecure employment, high living costs, indebtedness, and inadequate official relief. The average slum dweller lived on a financial knife edge. If they could work, they worked to exhaustion, and they remained poor. If they could not find work, or were too sick and old, they relied on family, if they were lucky, or charity. Perhaps they would risk destitution. Money was spent above all on food and rent. Very little was left for clothing, fuel, or other needs. A minor economic shock could mean eviction, and indeed London slum dwellers were highly mobile, often forced to move when they fell behind on rent, and they often did. Some ended up in common lodging houses, called doss houses as a semi-permanent lifestyle, paying nightly for a bed in a crowded dormitory, another facet of the slum economy. Well, somebody had to do something about this. Surely. It was noticeable to everyone, and some people took the steps themselves. Long before the government got seriously involved in housing or welfare, individual and organized philanthropy stepped into that breach. The Victorian era is famous for its energetic philanthropist, who funded charities to tackle social ills, and the slums of London were a prime target for their efforts, especially from the 1860s onward. One major area was education and child rescue. The Ragged School Union started in 1840, with Lord Shaftesbury as its figurehead, set up free schools in impoverished areas to give basic education and religious instruction to slum children. These ragged schools often run in lofts or stable yards with volunteer teachers, and they reached thousands of children who would have otherwise had no chance. Dr. Thomas Bernardo, as we've mentioned a few times, established not only orphanages, but also these ragged schools and workshops to train destitute boys in trades. His famous motto was, "No destitute child ever refused admission," a direct challenge to the workhouse approach. By the 1880s, Bernardo's homes were housing over 1,000 children, and similar institutions like the Maria Rye Homes for Girls or the Waifs and Strays Societies sprouted. Religious missions played their own role too. Christian evangelists, both Anglican and nonconformist, set up city missions in slum districts. Sure, they'd be preaching, of course, but they were often providing soup kitchens and penny dinners along with shelters. The Salvation Army, founded by William Booth in 1865 in East London, was particularly influential. By the 1880s, they had food for the body and soul programs, including cheap food depots and night shelters for the homeless. William Booth's book, In Darkest England and the Way Out, 1890, laid out a scheme for social relief that included hostels, training centers, and even farm colonies for the urban poor. While not all of Booth's grand plans came to fruition in Victorian times, The Salvation Army did start some and demonstrated a model of practical help combined with a moral uplift. Another philanthropic innovation was the concept of model dwellings, decent housings for the working class, provided by charitable companies. The Peabody Trust, endowed by American banker George Peabody in 1862, built large tenement blocks in various parts of London, offering flats with ventilation, courtyards, and shared facilities at affordable rents, though still somewhat above what the poorest could pay. The first Peabody buildings opened in Spitalfields in 1864, right amidst slum territory. Others followed in Westminster, Deptford, etc. Similarly, the Guinness Trust of 1889 and organizations like the Metropolitan Association for Improving the Dwellings of the Industrious Classes, say that 10 times fast, founded earlier in the 1840s, constructed hundreds of new units. The efforts were limited relative to the scale of need. By 1900, only tens of thousands of people were housed in such model dwellings, out of hundreds of thousands in the slums that needed them. But they proved that better housing could be built and managed, even for the lower-income tenants. Of course, by the late Victorian era, there was a small but growing movement for broader social reform that extended into politics itself. Some social reformers entered Parliament or influenced it. Lord Shaftesbury, that is Anthony Ashley Cooper, is an early example, known for his factory reforms and child labour laws. He also advocated for better housing and chaired the Ragged School Union. His evangelical conservative approach was to improve conditions to stave off revolution or moral decay. On the other end of the spectrum, emerging socialists and radicals, such as members of the Social Democratic Federation or the Fabian Society, argued that poverty was structural and called for state intervention, an idea that gained quite a bit of traction by the 1890s. Journalists and writers kept public attention on the slums. Besides Dickens and Mayhew in the mid-century, later figures like George R. Sims wrote articles like How the Poor Live in 1883, describing Southwark slums in gritty detail, shaming the nation into action. These advocates often spurred middle-class readers to support charities or demand government response. The emergence of more democratic local government in London, the creation of the London County Council in 1889, provided an avenue for reformers to implement changes. And indeed, that same council in the 1890s started its own housing projects and began clearing some slums rather, under the new 1890 Act. The Poor Law itself came under criticism towards the end of the century. Reformers like Canon Samuel Bartlett, who founded Toynbee Hall, by the way, a settlement house where university graduates lived in Whitechapel to do community work, championed a more constructive approach to poverty than the Workhouse. Toynbee Hall was a hub of progressive ideas. From there sprung initiatives like evening schools for working men and clubs for youth, aiming to educate and elevate slum residents rather than just give them food for the night. The settlement movement spread to other cities and later influenced social policy. The idea of university settlements was to bridge the class divide and study social conditions specifically. And so, before we go, I'm going to do a few more little anecdotes and voices from the slums, just to spotlight a few lesser-known stories. Now first, we've heard of that watercress girl. We met this 8-year-old street vendor earlier. But her story bears one more mention for what it tells us about Victorian childhood. So here's a young girl who's never seen London's parks and doesn't even know where they are. The parks, she replied in wonder. Where are they? Her world was a few streets around Clerkenwell. When asked if she plays with other children, she is puzzled in the work. concept of play is foreign when survival is at stake. Quote, "We children never play down there, 'cause we're thinking of our living," she said of her mornings at market. Now that shows how poverty robbed children of childhood. The watercress girl's innocent wish, quote, "Would they let such as me go to the park just to look?" Now that is a bit heartrending, isn't it? Well, perhaps it did. The same reaction for those Victorian readers prompting charitable responses. Her voice, preserved in print, is one that helped 19th century society acknowledge the injustice faced by the youngest poor. And then we have the old Nichols 9 dead in the attic, which sounds as bad as it is. In the old Nichols slum, later made famous by the Arthur Morrison novel, A Child of the Jago, one anecdote often cited by reformers was the discovery of 9 people living and some people dying in one tiny attic room. All siblings of the same family, ranging from 29 years old down to infancy. This family had remained together as a strong family bonds, but at a terrible cost. Contagious disease ravaged them one by one. Such stories of extreme overcrowding, entire multi-generational families packed in a single room, helped spur the housing inquiries of the 1880s. But the uniqueness here is in the sheer number of adults who stayed under one roof rather than splitting up. It was later revealed that they feared that the workhouse would separate them, so they made the decision to cling together in their rented hovel. That image of 9 siblings, living, eating, and sleeping together in one space, it shows the slums weren't just den of vice, but also places where basic human attachments persisted, even in those hopeless conditions. And then we have the death of carrots. A notable anecdote from Dr. Bernardo's charitable work concerns a boy nicknamed Carrots for his red hair. According to Bernardo, around 1874, the boy was turned away from a Bernardo shelter one night because it was full. And a few days later, he was found dead, succumbed to the cold on the streets. Bernardo was haunted by this, and vowed never to refuse a child in need again, coining the pledge, "No destitute child ever refused admission." While Bernardo perhaps dramatized the story for fundraising purposes, there are rumors about that, it still resonated widely and highlights how perilously thin the line was between life and death for the children. Carrot's fate, put a name and a face, even if a pseudonym, to the countless anonymous street urchins. It influenced Victorian charity by emphasizing that delay or inaction could literally be fatal, children literally dying in the street. And then we have James Greenwood's undercover report, yielding memorable vignettes, such as the detail that entering the workhouse casual ward, he was handed a hunk of bread, his sole supper unless he had arrived in time for the once-per-day gruel serving. He also recounted conversing with fellow inmates, one whom joked that the workhouse bathwater was so filthy it looked like weak mutton broth. These small details published in newspapers scandalized polite society and became talking points. They also helped unify public opinion that reforms were needed in workhouse management, leading to some improvements in the 1870s. The anecdote of Greenwood nearly losing his boots to theft even inside the workhouse, the attendant of, quote, Daddy by name, okay, warned him to keep them near, as other inmates might steal them in the night. I wonder how he got that name. Well, that shows how destitute and terrible even a place designed to help them could be. Well, the last one is a little bit bizarre, often disbelieved in the early 19th century. It was that of a man selling his wife, effectively deserting her. so she would not be his financial responsibility, thus skirting poor relief obligations. While it wasn't common, it did happen. One report notes cases where a husband would auction off his wife for a few shillings in a market, rather than have her become a burden on the parish and on him. The most famous literary depiction is in Thomas Hardy's The Mayor of Casterbridge, but real instances were recorded in London's press as late as the 1840s. It's pretty shocking. Even poverty can fray the bonds of marriage and family. And do you think that marriages in our common day would break up because of money problems? How absurd. Well, it shows the lengths, at least, to which people might go to under the harsh poor law regime. A pretty extreme anecdote that reformers used to argue that the system undermined the most basic decency and social order. Certainly hard to argue with that. Well, we're at the end of our exploration into the slums today. And as you walk out of there, perhaps you look around at your own surroundings and think, yeah, this isn't so bad. Well, I'm going to thank the people who keep me away from poverty. That is, the patrons and supporters. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, and Dalbury. Thank you so much. And I will see you tomorrow, maybe, if you feel like coming back. It's been good to have you here with me tonight, or this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are. But for now, I say farewell. As always, lots of love to you all. Keep out of trouble. See you next time.